the goal of this is just to make sure that everyone is prepared and they know kind of what's happening right now. Robin will talk about this executive order. You heard about the executive orders that already existed during the Biden administration. And there's an email about that. I'll drop a link in the chat that also has a PDF that has all of the existing executive orders. What we also have is a list of all the new executive orders that may impact the old executive orders. It's not a direct comparison, so it's not going to be this perfect map, but we tried as hard as we could so you all can understand what currently exists and then what it may be at risk. And when I say at risk, I mean it's mostly related to funding or something that was in place not being in place anymore that you all that work on CVI utilized, or that we know that you all utilized or was helpful to the work that we all did. And the same thing just about like gun violence, if you were working on safe storage or different things like that. There's a lot of just conversations about all of that, because I know you guys, all of you don't just work on one piece of gun violence or CVI. And so we will make sure that we send that around to everyone. Again, if there's other pieces that we missed, or if you guys are like, I heard about this one thing, how does this impact the CVI, like everyone working on CVI? We'll make sure we have a team, and I'll talk a little bit about this at the end, but we do have a team of pro bono attorneys that can like rapid fire, like get us information and answer those types of legal questions. And they're all administrative lawyers. And so what that means is they're people who have studied and are experts on administrative law. And so they can get us answers on what a lot of us have probably woken up and thought over the last month about, like, what is this happening? Is this legal? How can we move forward? And so we wanted just to have Robin talk for just a second on the Second Amendment, the executive order that there's many executive orders, but the one that we're going to talk about today is executive order that was announced about 2 weeks ago on the Second Amendment. And then we'll talk a little bit more in the weeds about what we think may happen in the future. And just to kind of preview that, the way that we'll talk about this is, in a scenario, in different kind of scenario planning. And I know a lot of us do that, but what would happen if nothing happens that may impact the CVI field? Also, what would happen if there is no money that came out of things like CVI PI, or if that kind of gets wiped out, like what can we do? And then lastly, like thinking forward, if like, as we continue to move forward, as a community that works on CVI, what should we potentially be ready for as it pertains to funding, and specifically CVI PI or CVI funding that either came from DOJ, CDC, or NIH. But we'll talk, when you hear us talking, we're going to be kind of specifically zeroing in on the CVI PI funding, because it is a large chunk of what was a part of the work over the last couple of years. So Robin, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Amber. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We were pretty overwhelmed and both happy and sort of concerned to see so many people getting on, because we know that in these last weeks, so much has been happening that it's overwhelming for all of us. What we have done when we sent you the information for this call, and for those of you that don't have it, we'll make sure you get it, as Amber mentioned, is we've looked at the executive orders that have been issued since President Trump came into office to assess the ways that they may impact the work that is being done in the gun violence prevention space, and specifically with community violence intervention. It is Executive Order 14192, which refers to protecting Second Amendment rights. That specific executive order directs the Attorney General to examine all orders, regulations, guidance plans, agreements, etc., to assess the ongoing infringements of Second Amendment rights of our citizens and present a proposed plan of action to the President through the Domestic Policy Advisor to protect the Second Amendment rights of all Americans. And it specifically directs review of agency and presidential actions, including the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention documents, positions taken in litigation, et cetera. Now, the way that we read that is that it's going to include everything that came through that office. And just to take one step back for a second, I believe most of you know and understand the limits of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment, even though it was part of our Bill of Rights, wasn't actually determined to be an individual right, which entailed the courts protecting protecting individuals from infringement because of regulations until 2008. So it is a very recent change in constitutional law that makes the Second Amendment an issue at all for gun regulation. And really, the initial decision was very limited, and it's been expanded a little bit in a case called Bruin to include some regulations outside the home. Now, nothing the court has said indicates to us that the Second Amendment should present any issue with regard to funding for CBI programs. However, because the executive order does direct a review of all the actions that were taken by the Biden administration, as well as the office, the White House office, we expect, in addition to DOJ and the other executive orders which relate to efficiency and funding, and DEI in particular, that a lot of those funding streams are going to be reviewed in a harsh light. The date, the 30 days that was given for that review comes up on or about March 9th. So we expect something from the White House around that date. What we are asking from you, all of you, is that you stay in touch with us. We will do our best to evaluate the information that comes out, to help provide information and insight. In a minute, Corey's going to talk a bit more about that. But we would ask that we stay in touch. If you have information or receive communications that you're needing support around, if you need help understanding something that you receive, we are here for that. We want to help all the folks that don't have the resources for their own attorneys or for legal support to know that we are available. We're looking both for, we will be able to help internally as well as with pro bono support. There's lots of government and local, state government attorneys, city government attorneys that we're in contact with who will be dealing with some of these issues directly. And we want to make sure that the organizations on the ground dealing with this, as well as the government bodies that are going to be dealing with this, are in communication with each other and understand the issues at stake. So all of that is to say that there's more coming. We may not see anything related to CBI on March 9th, on or around March 9th, with regard to funding. That may be coming later. So a lot of this is just an unknown in general of how quickly they're going to move and how it's going to be responded to. But we do know that at some point in the coming months, there are going to be issues, whether it's around Medicare and Medicaid or whether it's around specific other funding streams, Department of Education. So we'll continue to update you all as we have more information coming out of the White House. And we also ask that you stay in touch with us if you have information. Amber mentioned this earlier, but in addition to doing internal analysis around what we, it's administrative law attorneys that evaluate this type of information, but we also are going to be looking at litigation issues. So whether or not there are appropriate litigation opportunities to protect existing funding that has already come in, or funding that may be entitled to be coming in. So please stay in touch with us. We need to know from you what you're hearing, what you're experiencing, and if you're interested in being involved in any of that. And our hope is that we will be able to amass a good amount of support to be able to fight back, to be able to be present as this evolves as quickly as possible. As was mentioned, there's already a lot of litigation happening around other White House actions. We want to make sure that we as a community are similarly prepared to act when the time comes, and it could be very quickly. So please know that Amber and I are doing our best to provide that legal support, to find others that are willing to provide it. And we are here for you. We can't, as Amber said, we can't promise that we have immediate answers to everything, but what we can promise is that if you send us your questions, we will do our best to get them answered. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Corey.
Thanks, Robin. That was a really helpful overview. I will start by saying, as Robin said, there's a lot of unknown right now. And so I think we'll see what happens on March 9th. We'll see what happens after that. I think, as everyone knows, this administration is incredibly unpredictable, particularly when it comes to funding. And so I just really wanted to flag two potential things that can happen. Again, this might happen on the 9th. It might happen a month from now. There's a chance it never happens, but there are two really important actions that the administration could take where we do potentially have recourse to sue and block the harms that they're going to cause. The first is on funding that has already went out the door. So there are folks probably on this call, or you work in cities and states that received grants from the Biden administration. Maybe it's on CBIPI, maybe it's Department of Education grants, and have commitments for maybe 2-3 year grants. And during the first Trump administration, the different agencies went after those grants that they disagreed with politically and canceled them. And so what that meant is the grantee received an email or a letter saying that they were revoking that funding. If that happens to you, we want to know, because there is potentially a way that you could sue to make sure that you continue to receive your funding. So that is definitely something to keep an eye out for. If you as a CBO, or if your city or state receives a notice that funding is being rescinded for a grant that was issued during the Biden administration, we could do something about it. The second is funding that potentially is going to be available in the future. So as Greg mentioned at the top of this call, a lot of people on this call helped to pass the first gun violence bill in 30 years, 2 years ago, and that bill has funding availability for the next few years. The administration is very likely going to try to disrupt that funding. And what they'll do is in the next solicitation, whether it's for CBIPI or a grant program with the Department of Education, they'll change some of the criteria illegally to make it harder to direct those dollars to CBI programs. And when that happens, a lot of people could potentially have standing to sue, but it's something that we're going to want to track closely to make sure that we protect those programs and we protect what Congress said those programs should support. And so those are just two of potentially many actions that this administration could take in the coming weeks and months, but they're two really important ones to protect CBI funding. Amber, I'll pass back to you.
Great, thank you, Corey and Robin. And before I turn it over to Jose and then talk more about kind of what folks can do next, I just want to kind of contextualize. I think some of you all know that I am an old young lawyer, if that makes sense. I didn't become a lawyer until I was 42. And so I know that I didn't know what a lot of the terms and everything meant. And so I'm also just going to try and make sure that I can reiterate what my understanding of everything is, but also just invite you all in the chat. If you have questions, please don't ask for legal advice in the chat, but just, this issue of gun violence and gun violence in our communities, especially community violence intervention, has been a bipartisan issue from the very beginning on all levels of government, and something that I think there's been very large stakes taken to make sure that nothing that we do violates the Second Amendment, because many people, if not everybody on here, wants to make sure that what the work that we're doing is not violating any laws, and that's why you guys have been so successful in the work that you're doing. And so when it comes to what's ahead, a lot of what you see in the news right now, because I know I've been waking up and I'm like, what does this executive order mean, or what's happening, is about whether or not something is constitutional or if it's illegal, right? If something is something that can be done by an administrative body, by an executive order. Can things be rescinded? Can things be changed? And how are things moving forward? And so the reason why we're talking to all of you all about CVI-PI and CVI, but in particular, the directives that we'll invite you all to talk to us about in the future about CVI-PI, is because there's a large amount of funding under DOJ or under NIH or CDC that may be things that are being looked at or have been looked at over the last couple of weeks, that there may be a conversation about, does this violate the Second Amendment or not? Maybe one question. And then also another question may be, does this need to be funded anymore? And so there's several what we call kind of legal questions that we can answer. And sometimes that answer is taking this to a court to decide. And so that's what you're hearing and what you're seeing kind of in the news right now when you hear, okay, well, there's this executive order and this judge has done an injunction or has done all these different things. What's happening is there's some sort of question that someone who has been impacted by these executive orders is asking the court to decide. And so over the next couple of weeks, and I would say months and years, we're gonna have there's a potential on the federal level, but let's just be honest, on the state and local level, where you guys are gonna probably have questions for us that are like, is this something that's allowable? We need someone to tell us, some judge somewhere, to help us understand and interpret whether or not this entity, whether it's a state, a locality, or the federal government, can move forward with the action that they're taking. It's critical right now for us to think about what Robin and Corey talked about, because there's a deadline that's coming up. So on February 9th, there was this executive order about the Second Amendment and the Office of Violence Prevention, which impacts all of CVI, CVIPI, all these different things that all of us work on. And there's a 30-day deadline. The 30-day deadline is in less than 2 weeks. And so that's the rapidness of us thinking about, if you have been impacted by, or there's the potential for you to be impacted by this executive order, we want to talk to you. And we want to make sure that you know that we are thinking through whether or not you could be directly impacted or you could directly be impacted in the future. So many of that is like, if you're on here, and I see a ton of people on here who got CVIPI funding, that means that you may be impacted by whatever happens in 2 weeks or in 5 months or maybe never, right? And so we have no idea what's going to happen, but we just want to make sure that you guys are ready. And to Erica's point about the system, we also want to make sure that this is not just something that we're just only talking about legal challenges or opportunities on the federal level, but states and local too, because I know I see a lot of people on here that represent cities and counties. And so we know that there's a lot of funding and infrastructure on different levels as well. And so if you leave here with anything outside of like the resources that we'll give you at the end, we just want to make sure that you all know that the reason why there's a sense of urgency and what we're talking about is because there's the potential that we will need to move quickly on some sort of legal action if something that you guys have fought for on the ground is potentially at risk because of what happens in this report. And so that's the kind of like what's right in front of us with the rapidness of needing to talk with you all. And a lot of that will be people, the types of people who may be impacted, or anyone who's gotten CVI funding from the federal government, anyone who's gotten and that includes CVIPI, but that also includes other types of funding as well. We will be able to talk to all of you on this call who have a question about that. If you're sitting there and you're wondering, like, I don't know if I got federal funding, or I don't know if it's from this year, if I have it in the future, I've got a 2-year grant or I've got a 3-year grant, do I am impacted? We will make sure that we get in contact with you this week to make sure we can have a one-on-one conversation with one of the 3 of us that's an attorney, or an attorney that's in your state that has been working with us that can answer your legal questions. We also are going to be partnering with a nonprofit legal entity that works on these big, huge legal issues all the time. And they have a team full of lawyers that's going to be working with us. So I know you all probably, I'm assuming you guys like me, Robin and Corey, but there's a whole huge other team of professionals and lawyers who have been doing this particular type of administrative law, litigation, thinking through these really tough legal issues, including funding from the federal government for decades. And so more to come on that, but we just wanted to let you all know that there's a team of people who are all working on this, and we wanted you all to be prepared for the rapidness that's in front of us. So I'm going to turn over to Jose for a couple of minutes just to talk about some of the policy issues that are policy opportunities that are intertwined with this. And then we'll save hopefully 10 minutes for maybe if there's a couple questions that were in the chat that we can answer, but also give